So Nvidia has a bit of a problem where they have an overflow of RTX 3000 series graphics cards. They launched the 4090 and 4080 with two models of the 4080, a 12GB and a 16GB version. In reality, the lower end 4080 can just be considered a 4070 because it actually has lower performance in some areas than a 3080. Nvidia most likely made this naming choice so they can raise the prices to 3080 levels. There's so much 3000 stock like the 3080 and 3070 and so on that it's affected what GPUs Nvidia is prepared to announce for this new generation. Speaking of which, it's built on the TSMC 4nm process, which is much denser in terms of transistor count compared to the RTX 3070. There's a huge focus here on improving ray tracing performance and AI performance as well. RTX 4000 also gets new tensor cores, supposedly up to twice the AI performance, and DLSS 3, which is Nvidia's new generation of AI upscaling. Now it looks to be taking a lot more input compared to before to better predict and upscale new frames. There looks to be pretty big improvements in performance, and the performance to power charts shown by Nvidia are extremely vague, but it does illustrate Nvidia's claim of the new 80 architecture to be substantially more power efficient compared to the previous gen. More specifically, they claim twice the performance at the same power levels, which is pretty massive. And as expected, it's a bit more tolerable to those higher power levels as well. And Nvidia mentioned that they've pushed the silicon to over 3 GHz. Whether the consumer cards will be able to hit those levels with overclocking and consumer grade cooling, we'll have to wait. So there were 3 GPUs that were announced today. As usual, it's a really premium and high-end stuff first. The more mainstream and budget cards trickle down as usual as time goes on. I will get into the specifics of each GPU in a moment, but in terms of what I'm personally going to be doing is going with a 3070 FE that I recently purchased a few days ago for $350 US. This GPU was used, but it's such a good price for a 3070 Founders Edition that I had to get it. And before this, I've been using a 1050 Ti. And to be honest, a 3070 or 3060 is plenty of power for most people. I just had to upgrade to a 3070 because there's a few games, particularly Battlefield and Apex, that were struggling to run on the 1050 Ti. So let's take a look at the new 4090 16384 CUDA cores, which compared to the previous gen 3090 Ti is over 50% increase. But then we get a look at something really interesting. The clock speeds for this generation see a pretty big uplift. Nvidia has kind of been hanging around at 1900 MHz for a while, but it looks like this GPU generation is quite a big breakthrough for them in regards to that spec. This also won't be just for the 4090. The next two cards also have higher clock speeds, and I'd expect most 4000 series cards to comfortably be around 2.5 GHz. And then as for the memory spec, looks pretty much the same as the 3090 and 3090 Ti, with 24 gigs of DDR6 VRAM. In regards to power, surprisingly lower than what most people were expecting. There were plenty of rumors of 500 watt, 600 watt, even 700 watt RTX 4000 GPUs. We might eventually see that on board partner cards. Nvidia does recommend an 850 power supply, but at least for Nvidia's own board, their 4090 tops out at 450 watts, which is the same as 3090 Ti. The 4090 also gets a bump in pricing. MSRP here starts at $1,600 USD, which technically puts it $100 over the 3090, but we'll have to see what actually happens when it launches with a much healthier market this time and lower demand. We might actually see it launch for that price. The other two GPUs that were announced were actually both RTX 4070s. These look spec-wise like very different GPUs once you take a closer look. One is 16GB model and the other is a 12GB model. Both are nice bumps over the previous 3080, which packed 10GB, which then was later met with a 12GB model. Now that extra 4GB of RAM on the 16GB model is nice, but it's not something that you're actually going to notice most of the time in terms of performance and actual frame rate. In most of the games out there, unless you're playing some really high texture packed games at really high resolutions. The biggest difference in fact is when it comes to the CUDA core count between these two 4080s, which is really confusing because one's not a 4080 Ti, one's not a 4070, they're both 4080s. The 16GB 4080 has over 25% more CUDA cores than the 12GB model, which is honestly super confusing. That's more than enough difference to call these cards completely different things, or at least name the 16GB model as a 4080 Ti instead of just calling them both 4080s. Now the reason they haven't done this is because there's actually a massive difference between the top 4080 and 4090, as well as more than enough room to add a future 4080 Ti. So this time around there actually seems to be a pretty big difference, and the 4090 seems to be worth it, unlike the 3090. The previous gen 3080 and 3090 were actually pretty close. Like if you bought a 3090 just for gaming, you were pretty much wasting money, because the 3080 was close enough and within about 10% most of the time. This time around, the 4080 and 4090 look like they're positioned completely different in terms of performance. Now unfortunately, the RTX 4080, both of them actually get a pretty big price increase over the 3080. Of course, it's not exactly a fair comparison, because the 3080 was for most part over its MSRP, but at least for now, the interesting discussion will be the 12GB versus the 16GB model. Now in terms of expecting performance, these definitely look like very capable GPUs, but as usual, the charts and figures provided during Nvidia's announcement are very vague. So looking at the two 4080s, that indeed look like significant performance margin between them. And keep in mind, these three titles have been tested with DLSS and ray tracing enabled. The performance uplift is pretty substantial, close to 2 times performance over a 3080 Ti and over 3 times in Cyberpunk, with what looks like a more aggressive ray tracing mode than for the 4090, which has 4 times the performance of a 3090 Ti in Cyberpunk with those particular settings, with 2 times the performance in other titles. So for the conclusion, Nvidia probably won't be too eager to launch stuff like the 4070s and 4060s until those 3080s and 3070s, for example, start to go out of stock. And for a little while, now the 30 series and 40 series are going to kind of coexist. And as you know, they're pretty much aware of this. In fact, they embraced it in their presentations, so really pricey stuff to kick things off. Not much to talk about in terms of performance just yet, but 30 series is still going to be something that people are looking at, and who knows, maybe there won't be that much of a performance difference. As well as those people that are just playing sweaty esports games like Valorant, like me, a 3060s or 3070 is going to be just fine for you. So let me know your thoughts down below, and as always, huge thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.